This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Welcome into episode 117, the 20,000 mile oil change, where today I'll be breaking down various samples from VWs and Audis that are going 20,000 miles and beyond on the used oil. Why spotlight these manufacturers in particular? Well, a customer reached out interested in just that. Data from VWs and Audis, and they had a few questions that we'll break down on today's episode. So the questions that prompted this episode specifically go like this. Is synthetic oil still good after 20,000 miles? At what mileage does oil steep down in quality? And is sludge an issue for synthetic oils after 20,000 miles of use? So my curiosity led me to gather data from the following VWs: Tiguan's, GTIs, Golfs, and Jettas. And on the Audi side, I pulled data from A3s, A6s, R8s, and Q7s. Why these vehicles in particular? Well, they have engine types which we have particularly strong averages for. We keep averages that are specific to the engine type. These averages exclude results that are abnormal in terms of metal content or contamination that is skewing the results beyond the point that it's a useful reference for comparison. We also tend to exclude wear-in samples because these are cases where metals and silicon are high, not due to a problem. These are results we expect to improve, and if you were to lump wear-in samples into an average file, then that would lessen the validity of that average file as a reference for what's normal for that particular engine type. Now, before jumping into the data, I have a few caveats that I want to lay out. This isn't an episode with a definitive list of samples with an excess of 20,000 miles. Many samples on file are from owners that didn't note mileage, either because they don't know it or didn't care to lend it. So whether fair or not, they have a lot of unknowns. So what I did was I tried to pull samples where we knew from what the owner provided, mileage, the engine type, the vehicle make and model, and went from there. On a similar note, we don't know whether or not some of the samples in question are from synthetic or conventional oils. When we get the oil in the lab, this is far past the point where you can identify whether it's synthetic or conventional due to the fact we're not looking at the oil as a base stock. We're looking at the oil past that point where there's so much overlap in terms of how these samples will look in testing, be it in the form of additives or viscosity. So there's not an identifying characteristic per se that will spotlight the oil being a synthetic or conventional. So unfortunately, in some of these instances, if the customer does not note what they're running, we're kind of left to wonder. And that's because you can take something like a Mobil 1 that is a synthetic product and compare it to, say, a conventional oil off the shelf at Walmart, and you might have quite a bit of overlap in terms of what those oils use. And of course, a 540 synthetic is usually going to look indistinguishable from a 540 conventional when you're measuring the viscosity at operating temperature. And again, they just don't use elements that really jump out in the spectral results as, oh, clearly it is a synthetic because of, the presence of calcium. Like both a synthetic and a conventional are almost always going to have calcium, which is a detergent dispersant additive, as well as the anti-wear additives. A lot of overlap. And that is often why we don't suggest that you need to run a synthetic or you need to run a conventional, because the fact is they share so many characteristics. Okay, so back to the customer's questions. The first one I'll answer with a non-answer, but that's for good reason. There's no definitive answer to the question, when will oil go down in quality? Contamination or the engine having a problem, just a couple of examples right off the bat, those can accelerate the process of the oil breaking down no matter how good it is off the shelf. So you really need to test your own engine's oil before assuming just based on other people's info that you've gathered online that, oh, I can obviously run Mobil 1 20,000 miles because, I heard Blackstone Joe talk about how good this Audi looked after doing it. These are examples to show you what's possible, but an engine that is struggling with contamination, it really doesn't matter what you buy. You can buy the most expensive oil that is on the shelf. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden a harmful contaminant won't wreak havoc, especially if it's really advanced. So there's no definitive answer to that question of when will oil lose its quality. And don't forget, this also ties into use too. So an engine that is being asked to do one form of use, be it a lot of highway mileage, steady RPMs, fewer heat cycles, that same motor is probably going to have a different wear profile than one that is being forced to do a lot of stop and go, a lot of short trips. You not only think about the wear profile, you think about the fact that, a lot of stop and go driving will often introduce fuel that doesn't get burned off. There are endless variables to consider from one engine to another, one driver to another. So these are some examples that will break down that will help show you what some engines are capable of and maybe yours, but a sample will tell you whether or not that is doable. So rely on the data, not so much comparisons to what you find on a forum or, what you might hear during this episode that kind of makes you wonder, could I do that with my engine, be it a VW, an Audi, or any other maker model? Similar to when will the oil go down in quality, it's difficult to talk about sludge in used oil analysis. The reason being sludge tends to stay behind in the engine. We're only able to analyze the oil that actually drains, right? So if you don't use a flush, for example, before you sample, then we're probably not going to see any sludge. A flush can kick that loose, and if you use one before you do the oil change, then we might find a lot of insolubles that have been let loose from inside the crankcase. So maybe we'll find evidence of sludge that way, but otherwise it's going to stay behind. We're only going to look at the oil that actually drained out. And on that note, we can see if the oil has thickened up, if the viscosity is, far outside the expected range, and we find a lot of insolubles. Those aren't necessarily indicators of sludge per se, but they can indicate that the oil was starting to break down. But sludge itself is usually going to stay behind. So that's not something that we're going to identify specifically in your sample, but we will look at the physical properties to see how that oil is holding up, not only the viscosity or insolubles, but we'll also look at the TBN. The TBN is the total base number showing you how much active additive is left, and it's particularly notable if you're interested in running longer. So if you ever want to extend your oil change interval, request the TBN. That will tell us if there is active additive remaining, which your engine needs to combat acids from forming in the crankcase. So without further ado, I'll now break down what samples from these VWs and Audis looked like after 20,000 miles or more, the good, the bad, and the ugly, or not so ugly, depending on the context. So let's get into it. I'll preface these by saying most of this is good news, and it's not because I had an agenda to find good news. I'm not here to encourage all of you to try some insane oil change intervals compared to what you've been running. It just so happened that we found a lot of encouraging results from people who are going quite a bit longer than our averages and longer than the recommended intervals from the manufacturer. So just turned out to be mostly good news. First, we're going to look at an A3 powered by Audi's 2.0 liter turbo. This customer went 20,509 miles on the oil. They only need to add 2 quarts of makeup during that time, not enough to really significantly dilute the metals that we find in testing. The added makeup probably did help with the TBN though, which read 4.0. That's a strong reading showing plenty of active additive left. The TBN, as well as a normal viscosity, both reliable indicators of that oil holding up well after all of that use. And what was the oil in question? It was Motul 8100 XS 540. This engine is wearing well. We suggested a longer run. Some of these I'll go rather quickly. Some of them I'll break down in more detail depending on how complex the scenario was. Next up, we have an A6. This one's powered by Audi's 3.2-liter V6. Now, the customer sent this sample in because they were anticipating or looking for signs of a problem that might explain an odd noise they were hearing. They were describing a rattle specifically, and they wanted to know if there was anything else that might be lurking before they went to work to discover the noise. Hopefully it was due to an external component. It certainly looks like that would have been the case because this engine is wearing incredibly well in this report. We're looking at a 20,000 mile oil run with an oil that it's tricky to determine exactly how well it held up because they did not note the oil, not the brand, not the blend, not the weight. But the oil that was in place clearly did a good job of cleaning and lubricating based on the healthy wear levels. The oil filter wasn't used up because insolubles are low. There was just a slightly high silicon level, so we suggested checking the air filter, but overall, this sample looks fantastic. Moving on, we have an A6, powered by the 3.0-liter TDI engine. Absolutely no problems turned up after a 27,900-kilometer run. So they're tracking kilometers, not miles, but this is still an interval north of 20,000 miles if you do the conversion. And we're looking at not only healthy wear levels, but also a TBN that showed a little bit of active additive left. So we did suggest a longer run. The oil in question was Fuchs Titan Super Synthetic 0W30. There was some fuel that probably helped thin this a bit. Not a cautionary amount though. And the oil was still doing a good job even without a viscosity that was quite in spec. I pulled data from Q5s. It turns out that most Q5 owners just weren't that adventurous in terms of the oil change intervals. This one in particular I pulled was a 17,000 mile sample, so certainly still getting their money's worth out of the oil change. And we did suggest a longer run. All good news from a wear standpoint. The TBN was 2.5, showing some active additive left. Viscosity, well within range for Castrol Edge Euro 0W40. Nothing that really looked like a concern. As with the Q5 example, when I was looking at R8 samples, it just turns out that most of them came from lower mileage intervals, at least in relation to this customer wondering about 20,000 mile intervals being doable, but nevertheless, Audi's 5.2-liter V10 in this particular instance proved capable of an 11,000-mile run, and we suggested a longer interval next time based on healthy wear levels, an oil filter that wasn't used up, no contamination. The viscosity missed the expected range for Mobil 1 040 by the slimmest of margins, so nothing concerning from that standpoint. Now we have some particularly impressive results, these coming from a Volkswagen 1.9-liter TDI. The customer reported 35,000 kilometers on the oil, the first sample from the engine. Sometimes, we look at samples that are almost suspiciously good in the sense that, we know to check metals on a per mile, a per kilometer basis, and then compare them to averages. And sometimes engines are making so little metal, we do inquire about whether or not there might have been a typo on the slip, just because that's us doing our due diligence. It's one thing for an engine to be wearing incredibly well. It's another thing to be making so little metal that we do have to wonder if the clerical details are accurate. But for an interval that, if accurate as noted on the slip, we're looking at nothing but healthy wear, a viscosity that's normal. The customer did not request a TBN, which makes a specific mileage recommendation a little tricky, but we don't have reason based on the results we could obtain to advise against a longer run. Next up, I'll be talking about a sample from a 2015 Golf, this one powered by a 2.0-liter TDI. This is an interesting example in the sense that not only were they going a long time between oil changes, putting 30,000 miles on the oil, they also reported doing a lot of city driving. And what's interesting here is, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes city driving, a lot of stop and go, that can go hand in hand with excess wear or a little more wear than average. Not in this case. everything looks very good from a wear standpoint. So, even though I'm bringing up instances where some engines are able to outperform expectations, it really depends on who's driving them, what operation exactly they're seeing. Some owners may not be noting a lot of highway mileage, but at the same time, if what they are doing still isn't too strenuous in general, then they may wind up with very good wear results and oil that held up well, as in this case. So that engine, again, able to handle an excess of 20,000 miles on the oil. Switching gears, I was looking at samples from Tiguan's, a couple of 2012s, powered by a 2.0 liter TSI. They're both going over 20,000 miles between oil changes with healthy wear and nothing concerning in the physical properties. Which sort of brings to mind, some owners are concerned about manufacturers recommending, intervals longer than they're comfortable with, not even sniffing the 20,000 mile goal we're talking about. But they think sometimes that manufacturers are asking too much of the engines on purpose to get them to buy more of them. And if that's the case, it's not working for these owners because they're doing just fine going north of 20K and still winding up with good results. Sticking with VWs, I had another sample from a Golf, this one powered by a 1.9 liter TDI, and this one looked pretty good. Now, here's an important caveat though. Despite going a whopping 43,000 miles on the oil, metals were still in fairly good shape. However, it's not simply due to the engine, vastly outperforming averages. There was quite a bit of makeup oil present. So makeup oil has the effect of diluting metals down. So what happens is metals appear to be lower than they really are because that fresh oil that you're adding doesn't have any metals. So your engine is still producing metal. It just appears that it's not making as much as it really is due to that fresh oil diluting the metal that's being made. The benefit, however, of adding that fresh oil is it does work as a sort of continuous oil change, freshening up the additive package and therefore boosting the TBN back up. And of course, diluting metals, it's not a bad thing. It just means that it can cloud a bit of the wear profile. However, it doesn't prevent us from detecting any and all problems. You can still see troublesome shifts in the way metals are balanced, and we will factor in the amount of makeup relative to the sump capacity. And that way we can still see if there's anything less than ideal from a wear standpoint. From the good news to the not so good news in the sense that, we were suggesting some shorter intervals in these instances. I have a few examples where owners were going in excess of 20,000 and we did not suggest longer runs, not necessarily due to a problem in each case, but I'll break down some instances where the comment did not include suggesting sticking with that interval or running longer. So first up in this category, I have a sample from an Audi 3.0 liter TDI powering a Q7. This owner was going 27,000 miles between oil changes. The TBN showed some active additive left, but here's a reason why a TBN is not the only data point you want to rely on. There was quite a bit of metal in the mix. Now, we expect Arryn in particular to track closely with the miles, because the majority of wearing components are steel, and you'll see that iron should be dominant. It is here. That's not necessarily a concern. But the engine was also making a lot of chrome from the rings. You had a lot of tin as well. That's an alloy element. And along with the aluminum, we are also finding it looks like that can show bearing wear. Now, you don't really want to see a lot of metal from the rings or a lot of metal from the bearings, even if you're running quite a bit longer than what averages show as typical. So even despite a fairly good TBN, the engine is making quite a bit of metal and the viscosity is a little thick. So it looks like a shorter run is ideal. We also spotlight a couple of potential issues, one being in the form of a high silicon level. Keep in mind, no matter how long you're running the oil, dirt and debris still shouldn't be getting past the air filter. And maybe that's accounting for some of the metal we're finding. It's entirely possible that, it's not simply the oil run being too long. Maybe this wear profile will improve once that silicon is no longer an issue. But in any event, it's not smart for us to say, yeah, run longer, because the truth is we are seeing more wear than we expect for mileage on the oil. And it looks like there could be an ongoing issue with the air filtration setup. Speaking of metals not necessarily being normal for the oil run, I had another sample from a 2000 Golf powered by a 1.9 liter TDI. And in this case, bearing wear was a bit concerning, regardless of the oil change interval. And we also noted a viscosity that was very thick relative to the expected range for a Rotella T6 540. So in addition to bearing wear being a concern, and remember, it's not really something you want to see accumulate just due to a longer run, you also have an oil that was quite thick. And that, along with the wear profile, prompted a shorter interval. But the thing is, when you're talking, in excess of 40,000 miles on the oil, it's entirely possible that engine could stick to something, north of 20,000 and still get away with it and look pretty darn good. But it's reason to kind of slow down a bit and, of course, take a look at how the engine is handling it. So even if you're confident that an oil run well beyond 20,000 miles is doable, take a look at the wear levels, see where they're at before you ask too much of that engine. Another context where it can be tricky to advise a longer run is a young engine that isn't far removed from wear-in. Case in point, a 2010 Jetta that was going 30,000 miles on the oil, pushing that 2.0-liter TDI quite beyond the recommended interval from the manufacturer. And that Castrol 530 did not have a lick of active additive left with a 0.0 TBN, which is, come on, 30,000 miles. It's hard to be mad at that. But the thing is, there's a lot of metal here too. Potassium, silicon. Now, for a young engine like this 2.0-liter TDI, a lot of the metal could be wear-in. A lot of the potassium, hopefully all, is harmless flux, and silicon is likely sealer material primarily. But until that wear-in metal is gone, it's really difficult to say from our standpoint how exactly that engine is equipped to handle a longer run, not to mention the fact the oil was clearly past its point, with no active additive left. So that, in concert with a thick viscosity, reliable indicators that a shorter run should be used next time. Again, at 30,000 miles, it could well prove capable of something closer to 20, but when you're starting out, when you have a newer motor, it's always a good idea to get that wear-in out and then test the limits, because we can at least see how the engine is handling it when it's simply the metal being made during its oil run, not so much a lot of lingering wear-in. But we also knew that there were some results that weren't necessarily typical for wear-in either, that being a high chrome level from the rings. But it's certainly possible that once that wear-in is gone, and you shorten that interval to help accommodate the active additive supply and the viscosity, you could still certainly outperform average. But there are things you want to keep an eye on. And again, it all goes back to your engine, what point at its life the engine is in, and then looking at the results and seeing what they show is doable for you and the oil change interval you're interested in. All right, so that just about wraps up today's show. As you noticed throughout the episode, not every case had a specific brand or blend mentioned, and partially that's related to the information provided on the slip. So it's a good reminder too, if you want as complete and detailed a report as possible, let us know the engine make and model, the oil type you're sampling, and we'll put that on record for you. If you're interested in running longer between oil changes, just go to the back of your slip and mark yes for interest in extended oil use. And we'll suggest a longer run, but we'll also suggest a shorter run if we think that's what you need to do. The comment is going to hold everything as far as, what we view as a potential or a developing problem. And it will also include a mileage recommendation if you are interested in running longer. And even if you aren't interested in running longer, we won't hesitate to throw out a shorter run if that's what it looks like the engine needs based on the results. So keep in mind, it's personalized to you. So even if you heard some examples today where you're like, oh, well, that engine was able to do 20,000, 30,000, mine should be too. Well, keep in mind, it's not just about the engine you own or the oil you're running. It's about what you're asking of the engine and what you're asking of the oil, and whether or not there are other factors, things like contamination, signs of excess dirt or coolant or fuel, Those are enemies that, unfortunately, no oil is really fit to beat. Oil is good at cleaning and lubricating when there are not things that are preventing it from providing the necessary lubricity that your motor calls for. Because if the oil is chock full of contamination, it's just not going to do what it's designed to. And keep in mind that oils have different starting TBNs as well. So, one oil might have a stronger TBN to start, which stands to reason it might do better on a longer run than others. Sample your oil to find out what's going on in your engine, and we'll take it from there. What I hope today's episode spotlighted, though, was that some engines are capable of intervals that you might not have ever thought. It's just that you need to see what's going on with your motor first before assuming what it can do. The oil will tell you, so just go ahead and take a sample. Next oil change with a free test kit that you can order off our website, and we'll take it from there. Now, switching gears to our social media channels, you'll want to keep your eyes peeled on the Instagram and our Facebook pages, where we'll be posting a video spotlighting the flashpoint test. This is part of our standard analysis, and it's an interesting behind the scenes where you'll get to see how we do the flashpoint test and learn what that test will tell you about whatever it is you're sampling. It's particularly useful when you're looking for contamination from fuel or anything that is solvent-based. So if you're interested in that test, how we run it, what you'll learn from it, that video will cover the bases. So make sure you're following our Instagram, or you can like our page on Facebook, and you'll be able to see more of the flashpoint as well as previous videos we've done spotlighting things like the viscosity or the spectral exam. Thanks for hanging. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.